Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I want to talk about the use that people now make of tax havens. Now, I've already done a video talking about what tax havens are, and I emphasised in that video that in fact the feature they all have in common is the provision of secrecy, some form of structure, whether it be around bank accounts, or whether it be about companies, or whether it be about trusts, and in particular these days, by the way, in particular about companies and trusts, because banking secrecy has by and large been broken now, that means that the people who use these places cannot be found out to be doing so. Now, why would you want to do something that you don't want people to find out about? That is the obvious question. And what is this something that you might want to do behind what I call the veil of secrecy that a tax haven or secrecy jurisdiction provides? Now, historically, there was a great deal of tax evasion in tax havens. Quite literally, people would turn up on the doorstep of a bank in places as familiar as Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, but the Cayman Islands and elsewhere, and deposit that money in a bank with, well, virtually no questions asked. And that was how the tax haven world worked. But I will be honest with you, that is not how it works now. Those who I know who are insiders in the system will acknowledge that once happened, and they equally tell me, and I'm sure they're right, that new legislation on money laundering, on regulation on how a person, even in a tax haven, must know their client and properly identify them by demanding that a passport, for example, be presented to prove who they are, means that frankly that type of tax abuse has really ended. But that has not ended the tax abuse provided by tax havens. I will stress, though, that the use that people have made of tax havens with regard to tax has changed. It used to be that, as I've just noted, suitcases of cash turned up. Effectively, this was abuse of income taxes. And that was commonplace by individuals. There were notorious jokes about Belgian dentists who used to take their money over the border into Luxembourg and bank it there. There were certainly large companies who were flagrant in their abuse of tax havens and their abuse of tax regulation to shift profits into tax havens. And there is no doubt that some still try to do that. But the means to control both those activities have substantially increased over time. The basic personal tax abuse has been brought under control to some degree by money laundering regulation, which does apply to most tax havens around the world, and by what is called automatic information exchange arrangements, which most tax havens have now signed up to, organised by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, based in Paris, which requires that tax havens do now report the basic ownership of many of the structures that exist in those places to the countries where the real owner of them does actually live, so long, of course, as that real owner can be identified. Now, that's easy in the case of a bank account in the name of Joe Bloggs, whoever Joe might be and wherever Joe might live. But it's much harder, of course, in the case of a trust, where it's very easy to disguise true ownership. And that's even easier if you actually have a tier of ownership of offshore structures. So you have a company in one jurisdiction, let's call it Jersey, owned by another company in another jurisdiction, let's call it the Isle of Man, which is then owned by a trust in another jurisdiction, let's call it Guernsey, and which then banks in yet another place, let's call it the Cayman Islands. Do that and it becomes very much harder to locate what's going on. So automatic information exchange is not perfect, but it helps. So what's really happened is that the focus of offshore tax abuse has moved away from this hiding of income, although many tax campaigners still focus on it. And a great deal of offshore tax abuse has to do with something else, and that is with taxes on capital. Now, capital is literally the assets that a person owns. And there's two types of thing they're trying to avoid when it comes to taxes on capital. One is paying tax on the sale of their assets, and here it's very common to structure the ownership of businesses offshore if a person can manage to do that legally, because in that case they will usually significantly reduce the amount of tax that they pay compared to having to pay it in the jurisdiction where they actually live. And the second thing, which is perhaps even more common now than that one on capital gains, is to try to get round inheritance laws. Now, in many countries like the UK, it's quite hard to get round inheritance taxes because property is taxed on a worldwide basis. In many countries too, there are also very strict laws about who will inherit from a person. For example, it's actually true that in Jersey, bizarrely, it is specified in law basically how an estate will be split up on a person's death. And you have to go to court to actually overrule what law lays down. For example, if you want to keep one child out of benefiting for some reason, like you haven't seen them for the last 70 years. So those structures are often also the subject of tax haven activity, either trying to get round the charge to tax on an inheritance or simply trying to leave money to people who you don't want to actually pay it to. And hiding the money offshore is a way that people try to get round the domestic laws of their country with regard to those inheritances. That, I believe, is a significant use of tax havens. But what it also hints at is something else, and this is the other big use of tax havens now. And it's got actually nothing to do with tax at all, but it has a great deal to do with regulation. And regulation, of course, impacts on very many aspects of a business's affairs. And there are businesses who are more than willing to comply with regulation and who are good, upright, honest members of society. And I like those businesses, and I'm not going to knock them. I'm not anti-business, never have been and never will be. There are also businesses who do not like to comply with the regulation that society imposes upon them and try to cheat their way out of their obligations. They want to, for example, employ people in ways that the law of their domestic country would not allow, and can find a way to do that. This is exceptionally common, for example, in side shipping, because where is a ship? Well, it's not anywhere very often, and so it's commonplace to set up payrolls for shipping companies in tax havens, because that way the laws on employment, hours of work, minimum pay, and also very often the deduction of tax will not apply. Ships themselves are often registered in tax havens so that tax is not paid, which it might be if they were registered in the country which they really regularly sail to. Other law can be avoided. For example, I've seen examples of competition law where one person owns two companies which undertake remarkably similar activities, for example in publishing, which would not be allowed by the competition law of a country, and the ownership of one is hidden in a tax haven. It's possible that environmental law may be got round in this way, and so on. There will be a regulation that is abused somewhere by the person using the tax haven. The point I'm making is that the tax haven deliberately provides this opportunity for the law of another country to be undermined, and it deliberately provides secrecy to make it harder to identify the person who is undermining that law of another country. But the law that is being abused is not necessarily with regard to tax. So just because you see someone using a tax haven, it doesn't mean they're a tax abuser. They may just, for example, be cheating on their husband or wife by hiding assets from them in the event of a forthcoming divorce. That is what tax havens are used for. Bluntly, they're used by people who want to cheat. And you can't summarise it more briefly than that. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in what I've been saying in this video, please subscribe. There is a button below the viewing screen. If you're interested in what I have to say on Twitter, I'm at Richard J. Murphy on that medium. If you want to look at my blog, that's taxresearch.org.uk, and we have a Facebook page as well, Richard J. Murphy. So one of those things will get you more information on what this video series is about, and I hope I'll see you again soon.